Hello everybody. In this tutorial we will write a simple rock, paper, scissors game. Sounds exciting, right? We've covered a lot of theory so far in our previous tutorials, and I think it's about time that we actually write something hands-on. Now, I will be providing a template for the beginning of this game. I will attach the link in the description to this video to the repository where you can download the code that I will be using to start the game. And otherwise, we will be making use of quite a few new concepts, such as event listeners in JavaScript. We will be attaching functions to button clicks and so on. It should be fun. Let's get to it. So, rock, paper, scissors game. This is going to be a complete improvisation. I haven't prepared for this. The purpose of this video is to actually show you how I'm going to be approaching the problem solving, how I'm going to be making mistakes, and how I'm going to be solving those mistakes. So let's get right to it. I'm going to walk you through the code. Here we have a simple HTML. And right now I have the hidden class on a few elements right here. I'm going to get rid of it to demonstrate what it's going to look like. So the player is going to click the play game button, and then this selection will appear where player will be able to select either rock, paper, or scissors. And then the AI, our program, will generate the response to the player's selection. This will be a random generated computer selection. So eventually we will show an alert of who the winner is, and this is really how the game goes. Let me bring back the hidden class and let's start. So what do we have here? We have the play game button. Then we have a container that holds 3 buttons with a possible player selection. Then we have this VS sign, and we will be showing the computer selection right here. And then with an alert window with alert pop-up, we'll show the game result. And this is it. This is pretty much how the game goes. So let's see. I'm here in game.js, and I created a few functions here that will be our utility functions. They'll be used to hide or show certain elements. And then right here, we have a self-invoking function, which is the function that will trigger automatically as the page loads, as all elements in our script loads. And this is where we'll be placing main function calls of our game logic. Right? Game state is an object I created to store the game state, basically to store the player selection, the computer selection, and so on. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's try and write something. So we have this play game button. Probably I would want to initialize something as user clicks on this game. So how about first we attach an event listener to this button and see if we can actually trigger something based off the click on this button. So let me write something out. First, I need to see how I can refer to this button, and I have an ID. Now, we haven't covered these concepts yet in our previous tutorials, and we will get to them going forward, but for now, just go with it. I will be explaining what certain things do, and it will be fun, I promise. So I'm gonna say document.get element by ID. I'm gonna pass that ID as the string. So all it does is it says, okay, get a hold of this element on the page, this HTML element that has this ID, play game. And let's actually see, let's put it in the variable and see if we can retrieve it. And let's just log it right after we retrieve it. Let's inspect element, see the console, refresh the page. Document get element by ID is not a function. Actually, it looks like I messed up the syntax here. Document should be lowercase. Let's refresh. And there we go. It retrieved our play game button. At this point, I want to attach an event listener, something that will trigger on click of this button. First, maybe I'm gonna rename start to start button to make the variable name more meaningful. Now let's add an event listener to this button. Let's say start btn on click start game. And start game is the name of the function that I haven't defined yet. So I'm gonna define one. I'm gonna say function start game. And inside of that function, I'm gonna put a log statement where I'm just gonna say button triggered. I'm doing this to test that our event listener is working, which it should be doing. So as I click, you see how we're getting this button triggered message. And the more we click, the more messages we get. Perfect, so it's working. Now, what do I want to do? Maybe in this start game function, I want to initialize something. I want to initialize the initial game state. And that is exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get rid of this and I will say game state equal, I'll make it equal a new object that will have the following signature. I'll say player selection. For now, let's keep it as none. I'm gonna say player selection. And I'll keep it as null for now. And also I'm gonna say AI selection. It's also null. And result, I'll make that an empty string. This is going to be one piece of a puzzle, just the initial game state. And now other thing I want to do is maybe I want to show these buttons. Maybe I want to show the possible selections for the player as I click this play game button. So let's try and do that. I'm gonna bring this class back and hide it by default. And now I need to get a hold of these buttons. I need to get a hold of this entire container because this is what we are hiding by our CSS class. So I will need to grab it. And in JavaScript in the browser environment, there is another way to grab it. One way we could do is we could use this getElementById function to get a hold of an element. Otherwise, we do have a class here. And other thing we could do is we could use the query selector. Let me show you what I mean. Let me create a variable. I'm going to call it player selection. BTNs, and I'll say document.querySelector. And over here, as a parameter, you pass a string with CSS selector to the element. So in this case, it's a class, player selection. And what I'm gonna do is I'll grab that and I'll pass that class to this function. Let's see if it works. Let's log it. Refresh the page. Press the button. See what this is telling us? Assignment to constant variable. This is a very common mistake that you do if you define your initial game state or your variable as a const. You cannot reassign it. You can, however, add keys into it, but you cannot assign another value into the game state. So I'm going to just change this to let, save, and refresh. The error is gone. Play game, and we get an output of our container with player selection buttons. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show those buttons. I will say show player selection BTNs. Over here, I'm just using this other show function that I have defined before. So refresh and play game. Boom, we have our buttons. Now we can make our selection. Great, let's keep going. Now, one other thing I'm gonna do is I will assign event listeners to these buttons because I need to capture the button click. Right now, it is not capturing anything. I need to know which button has the player clicked and which element of the game was selected. Let's see how we can do that. So we could assign event listeners to each individual button, but I don't really like that approach as much. I'm gonna give these buttons a class. I'm gonna say class game elements. And now this thing, I don't like how it's called right now. I'm gonna rename it. I'm gonna say game elements container. Let's just refresh, make sure this works. And it does. So this class game elements, I'm gonna copy it and paste. Just so every game element, every possible selection has this class, and we can refer to these guys over here with that class. So let's grab them. Const game elements. And I will use the same syntax. I'm gonna say game elements, except here, instead of query selector, I will use query selector all. The difference is that query selector, when you use that, it will grab the first element in the HTML page that matches that CSS selector. Query selector all, however, will grab all elements with that matching CSS selector. So game elements, I'm gonna add an event listener on every game element. One mistake that I made here, I assigned this class to images. I want it on the buttons. So over here, I'm just gonna get rid of it. And here. And I'm gonna give that class to my buttons. I have a node list of 3 elements, rock, paper, and scissors. Perfect. Here's my game elements. And other thing that I don't quite like right now is this class name, player selection. I'm gonna call it player selection container. Now, as I have my game elements, I want to iterate over them and give every game element an event listener. Remember our for loops tutorial? I should be able to say for GE for game element of game elements. And I should be able to say game element on click equal function. This notation here is same notation we used before. It's basically assigning a function to the event that will happen on click on this element. And let's just throw another log statement there real quick to test it. Click works. Refresh, play game. Of course, it should be let g. We're defining a variable. Click works, click works, click works. Perfect. And maybe inside of that function, I want to have some logic that will populate the player selection in the game state. Also, I may want to have that function outside of this main start game function to keep it cleaner, to keep it more readable. So I'll define another one. I'll say function handle player selection. And I will use this handle player selection as the on-click function, as a logic that will happen on click on that game element. Also, inside of this function, I will be able to get a hold of each individual game element of rock, paper, or scissors. So let me show you what I mean. In the function, I can actually, if it is an event listener in JavaScript, I should be able to refer to that element as this variable. We haven't touched on that topic in our tutorials yet, but just know that in this case, the variable this is going to refer to the DOM element, to the HTML element over here, that we are clicking on. So if I console log this in handle player selection, I will be seeing that in the console output. So I clicked on player rock element, paper, and scissors. Perfect. Now over here, I should also be able to grab these elements IDs as the string. So I should be able to say const selection, just to clean this up a little bit, equal this dot ID. And in this context, you can think of this as an object. Objects are familiar to us from our previous JavaScript tutorials. An object that has an ID property in it. And just to test this out to see if it works, I'm gonna console log selection, and we are getting that exactly, player rock, paper, and scissors. And how about we just store that selection in the game state? How about we just say game state dot player selection equal selection. And let's log the game state after that. Perfect, we're getting exactly that. Now, other thing that should happen after the player selection, we would want our AI to make the selection. So let's define a function that will do that. Make AI selection. We need to randomize the AI selection somehow. One possible way I can think of is placing all the possible selections in the list and then grabbing the random element from that list. Now we haven't touched on lists yet, but just know they are a sequence of values, similar to how we used objects, except list does not have distinct user-defined properties. List has indices. Let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna say const possible selections, and the list is defined with square brackets in JavaScript, and I'm gonna place all those IDs in the list. I will say player rock, player paper, and scissors. And I'm gonna say index to select. I will want to use the math library to get the random function, random number times 3. So this piece over here returns a random number with a floating point between 0 and 1. I'm gonna say times 3, and I'm gonna round that to the lowest integer, math floor. Put that as a parameter to math floor. So essentially what this will do, it will generate a random integer between 0 and 2, which are going to be the indices of our array, 0, 1, and 2. And let's return the AI selection for now to see if it works. Notice this notation. This is exactly the same notation as we use with objects. We're using the variable as the index of a list, and we're grabbing that value at that index. And I'm gonna log the AI selection. So let's see if that works. Play game. We're getting player scissors. Even though we clicked on the rock, player scissors is going to be the AI selection, and this is what we're logging here. Okay, our AI is making selections. Now let's populate the game state with the AI selection. So let's say game state, and maybe even over here, I'm not going to return that selection. I'm actually going to populate the game state right here. I'm going to say game state AI selection, populate with that value, possible selections, add the index to select. After all, let's see if our game state has all the values. So notice how here we're populating the game state with the player selection. After player selection, I'm gonna make an AI selection right after it over here. And I'm gonna log the game state to see where I am at. Let's refresh the page. Play game, we see our selections. I select rock, and here's what the game state look like. AI selection, player scissors. Player selection is player rock. Looks like I'm winning this time. Awesome. Now, probably one thing I want to do is to show the AI selection. As well as that, I maybe want to somehow visualize what I have selected as a player. So maybe I'd want to add another class to my selection over here. So let's say this selection, I could say selection dot class list add red. And I'm gonna define that class red. Maybe border of it will be 1 pixel solid red. Let's see if that works. And that will not work because selection currently is an ID. So I'm gonna say this dot class list add red. It is adding to every element as I change my selection. That is not the behavior I want. Maybe I would want to wipe that class from all elements and just give it to the one I clicked the most recently. Let's see how can I achieve that. Our buttons over here, they have the game elements class. So I'm gonna select all game elements again, the same way I did that before. And iterate again over all game elements for let g as game element of game elements. And on every G class list, I'm gonna remove red. Now, after I got rid of the red class on all elements, I'm gonna say this dot class list add red and see if that works. Perfect, I'm getting this nice red frame, but it's barely visible. Let me increase the width of the border. It's a little better this way. And this is the behavior we want. Now that we have access to the game state where we have the player selection as well as the AI selection, now we need to write out some logic that will handle the game itself. Now we just gotta write out a function that will populate the result of the game based on the both parties selection. So maybe I will define something and call it function calculate result. And this function will be looking into the game state and it will be doing some magic to populate the result of the game. So I could say here for convenience, const player equals to game state dot player selection, const AI equal game state AI selection. Now with this, I just need to write out a bunch of if-else conditions to verify whether rock beats paper or rock beats scissors, paper beats rock, and so on. So I'm gonna say if player selected rock and AI selected scissors, game state result equals player wins, and so on. I'm gonna write out all successful combinations for the player. Otherwise, if it's not matching any of those conditions, we'll consider that AI had the winning selection. Now, given this, I don't really like how this construction looks. I want to refactor this a little bit. I want to get rid of all these else ifs and just make it a little prettier and a little bit more readable. So let me do that. Now this is much better. We're still hitting all same conditions. We're gonna say if player selects a rock and AI selects scissors, or player selects scissors and AI selects paper, or player selects paper and AI selects rock. On all those cases, player wins. Otherwise, we're gonna say game state result, computer wins. And maybe one thing we want to do, we want to alert the game state result. Let's just see if that works. I'm gonna play game and select rock. I'm not calling this function anywhere yet. So maybe on the player selection, when players click their button, AI makes the selection, and then I want to calculate game result. So refresh again. Player wins. Computer wins in this case. So one thing we're not doing just yet, we're not showing the computer selection, and we are not cleaning up the initial game state after all. So let's take care of that too. On calculate result, maybe one other thing I want to do is I want to show what AI selected. So here my IDs are off a little bit. AI rock, AI scissors. Actually, it would make more sense to show AI selections in this function, since this is where we are performing the select. Let me declare another variable, ID to show. And this may not be the most efficient way to do it, but this will just give us a demo of one other string feature that we can make use of. See how our IDs here consist of AI dash and then the element, and then in the case of the player selections, our IDs look like player dash something. The part that doesn't change here is the element of the game itself, rock, paper, or scissors. So maybe what I would want to do is in the selection, in the random AI selection of this string, I would want to replace player with the string AI, and that will be our ID to show. That will be the ID that we'll use to grab the image over here and display it. So let's do that. I'm gonna use the string replace function over here. Let me just store that in another variable. I'll call it temp. And it will be holding that. The reason I do this is I do not want to mess up the actual selection of the AI. And I'll say temp dot replace. First parameter here is the search value, which is going to be the word player. And the second parameter is the replace value, AI in our case. We have our ID to show, and now all we should do is say document dot get element by ID, ID to show. This is our element on the page, and I'm gonna say show. Let's verify that behavior. Doesn't work just yet. Let's see what is wrong. Let's actually see if this ID is right. If this ID exists somewhere on the page, I'm gonna say log ID to show. And this is pretty much how you would be doing debugging in your programming career. We are already logging the game state here. Let's refresh the page. AI rock. The reason why AI selection is not showing up is because we have the hidden class not on the image itself, but rather on the parent container. This is just the one thing I missed, and everybody makes mistakes, right? So we still need to show either of these, but we do not want the hidden class on the container. So we could say show AI selection, possibly. Let's do that. Document query selector. The class name is AI-selection, and pass that element to our show function. Let's verify that. Okay, we are showing it, but we're getting the alert pop-up before that. We'll tweak that behavior later. For now, we are showing all of them. So maybe let's do the same thing we did before with the player selection here. Let's add a red frame to the AI selection. Since we already have this statement over here, get element by ID, and then I could say class list add red. Again, the same way as before. And other thing we're not showing yet, this versus sign. Let's do that too. Same way as we are showing the entire container, I could say show vs. Refresh, play the game, paper. See, right now we actually ran into an interesting scenario that we're not foreseeing in our code, is the case when our selections are the same. So just let's add that condition. Else if player equal AI selection, our game state result will be deuce. Awesome. At this point, we should be able to display the results. And now this is pretty much the end of the game. So we need to do some cleanup. Let's define a function to do the cleanup again. Cleanup will essentially be resetting the game state to its initial value, to the empty value, and then getting rid of all the red frames on our selections and hiding everything that should be hidden. Cleanup. Game state is an empty object. Let's grab all the red elements. Let's call them reds. Document query selector all with the red class. For R in reds, R class list remove red. And also initially this content should be hidden, player selection should be hidden, and so is this and that container. So both of those containers should be hidden. So I'm gonna say document query selector, player selection, class list, add hidden. Or actually, I don't even have to do that because I already have my utility function defined above. I can say hide this, hide VS, and hide AI selection. Let's see if that works. Use. Actually, we again are not calling this anywhere. One thing that really bothers me with how this game works is the fact that our alert statement shows up just before we are actually displaying the computer selection. I don't like that. And there is a way to fix that, or actually a few ways. One thing I can think of is using the timeout function. Let me show you what I mean. Over here, where we are saying calculate result, I'm gonna wrap this into a set timeout call, where the handler is going to be calculate result. And the second parameter is the timeout. It's the number of milliseconds after which this function will trigger. So I'm going to say 2000 milliseconds, which is essentially 2 seconds. I'm going to comment this out. Again, set timeout is a nice way in JavaScript to procrastinate the function call. First parameter is the function to call. Second parameter is the delay. Deuce result was calculated after 2 seconds, since both selections are rock. So maybe after the result calculation, I do want to perform the cleanup, and in here, in calculate result, after alert statement, I will clean it up. Let's see if that works. Paper. 2 seconds, computer wins. We get an error. Let's see what it is. Cannot read property class list of null. And it says it's over here on the line 19 is where the error is. Let's see the line 19, player selection. Oh, of course. Remember, query selector accepts the CSS parameter, and we're not passing this as the class. Let's save this and test again. Refresh. Rock. Player wins. It's cleaned up. Perfect. So there's your simplest rock, paper, scissors game. It might use quite a bit of cleanup, but for now we had so much practice and it's a great exercise, I find. We did introduce a lot of concepts that we haven't covered before. I highly encourage you to Google everything. This is how you learn. This is how you get better with JavaScript. And ask me questions in the comments section. See you in the next video.